weekday mornings, Angela Sloane liked to be the first pair of heels echoing across the marble lobby of the Price and West Property Group. If the motion sensor lights didn't flicker on with her, the day felt off, like a meeting where someone had already taken your chair. She was 32, tidy to a fault, and buoyed by the unspoken belief that her order, could keep the world civilized. Her cubicle was a shrine to lists, a corkboard of post-its in a 6x6 grid, a white mug that said, "Today I will," with a dry erase line she filled each morning. In the company, they called her the finisher. Angela would read a file, find the clause, and make the problem click into place like a snapped seatbelt. She thought of this as kindness in its way. People needed boundaries, buildings needed budgets, forgotten rent rippled into unpaid janitors and broken elevators. Someone had to sign the notice. Her boss, Victor Price, believed in a world even tidier than Angela's. If you could sand the corners of a neighbourhood and seal them in glass, he would. He ran his thumb along the edge of contracts, as if checking whether reality had been sharpened enough. The firm's new initiative, block renewal, was going to move 5 properties from neglected legacy stock to vibrant mixed-use assets. Translated, that meant the older tenants would go, the renovations would come, and in the ribbon-cutting photos, Victor's grin would sit like a billboard in the centre of the frame. On a Tuesday in early spring, Victor slid a folder onto Angela's desk. "You're my closer," he said, which in his mouth felt like both flattery and a hand on her shoulder steering her toward a cliff. "Unit 2, B, Lincoln Terrace, last holdout. They're 3 months late. Others have taken buyouts. This one's gotten sentimental." Angela tapped the manila tab. Jacobs, Harold and Bernice. The file was thin. Triple-checking the ledger, she saw late fees, a repair request for a leaking radiator that the building had noted, and a terse exchange with a paralegal. 3 months was clear. The ledger didn't show that Harold Jacobs had been a security guard in the old Kennedy Center downtown, or that his wife Bernice had taught choir for decades at a church that now stood behind fencing with a redevelopment banner drooping from the chain link. The ledger didn't know about birthdays or holidays, or the way tenants called each other hon in hallways fragrant with Sunday dinners. Angela went to Lincoln Terrace that afternoon anyway. She wore her least threatening blazer, the pastel one, and stuffed the notice into a leather portfolio that looked more like it should contain a resume than a writ. She rehearsed the script. "I'm so sorry to bother you. I'm Angela with Price and West. Our records show." Unit 2. B's door was painted the sort of blue that only families choose. Not the building's colour, not a landlord's realtor beige, but the exact shade that says we change this ourselves on a Saturday because life should look like us. She knocked. After a moment, a voice called, "Doors open if you've got good news." Harold Jacobs was there with a cane, a deep-chested man whose every movement suggested he'd once been able to lift a refrigerator and now preferred lifting a smile. Bernice came from the kitchen with 2 mismatched mugs. They didn't ask who Angela was exactly. They recognised the portfolio and the apology tucked behind her lips. "Let me guess," Harold said, easing into a chair by the window where a philodendron curled around the curtain rod. "It's our turn." Angela started the script. She meant to stay clinical, but the apartment pulled at the edges, framed photos across one wall, 12 or 15 of them, maybe more, a constellation of faces with new baby smiles and graduation caps and the stiff expressions of school portrait day. Names were lettered under each: Tori 1999, Samir 2003, Aisha 2007, Miguel 2011, Amari 2019. "Your grandchildren?" Angela asked, immediately wishing she hadn't, immediately remembering that friendly questions felt like traps when someone carried paperwork. Bernice laughed, light through chimes. Our children, she said, savouring the word like a truffle. We never could keep the house quiet. We adopted, Harold added, almost shy. Kept adopting. Some stayed a few years, some forever. They bring us more kids now. Lord, the house is never done filling. Angela's thumb found the raised edge of the notice. She told them they were late. She told them about payment plans, buyouts, options. She didn't tell them that Victor had a meeting Friday, investors breathing down his neck about clear timelines. She didn't tell them that in the office kitchen someone had said, the old couple. They'll cry. Don't let it get to you. It's not about crying, Bernice said, as if reading a page she'd seen before. It's about staying. This is where our kids learned to ride bikes along the hallway, where they slammed these doors at 13 and tiptoed back through them with babies at 23. Harold put his hand over Angela's folder. We're not stubborn. We're rooted. If we can pay, we'll pay. If we can't, we'll figure it. Angela left, promising to see what she could do, which was, she knew, the same as saying prepare yourselves. In the elevator, she wrote a new line on her mug. Today I will finish 2B. Then, heart stutter steady, she emailed Victor. He wrote back one sentence. Serve the notice. This was the choice. Be the finisher, or be something else she hadn't named yet. Angela served the notice. The first mistake, if we're calling things by their right names, was thinking she could do it without becoming part of it. She slid the paper under the blue door on Friday morning. While the hallway smelled like someone's cinnamon toast, she told herself that adults all must have their morning routines disturbed sometimes. She told herself the law was the law. By noon, Victor had a bottle of champagne in the fridge for his investor meeting. Block renewal. On schedule, the slide would say, with a progress bar ticked right past 90%. After the weekend, he told Angela, we schedule the marshal. Monday's a holiday. Tuesday work. Angela nodded. She heard her voice traitorously clear. If they make a partial payment, then we accept, he said, and continue. The process is the process. Accept and evict are not mutually exclusive. That night, instead of going to trivia with friends, where she would be good at recalling useless facts and bad at forgetting useful scenes, Angela sat on her couch with the file open and her laptop glowing. She researched assistance programs, she calculated payment plans, she stared at a number and imagined it as groceries and medicines and choir sheet music and bus passes. Angela's mother called. You sound busy, she said, which was her way of saying, you sound brittle. Her mother had once marched a picket line for nurses when Angela was in middle school and needed a ride to piano lessons. We're not just working for our own dinner, honey. We're working for the table. Angela said, yes, yes, then hung up and whispered to her empty apartment, whose table? On Sunday, she went back to Lincoln Terrace without the portfolio. Outside, the block held its two kinds of time, one that moves with people's lives and one that waits for cranes and capital. A mural on the building facing theirs showed the neighbourhood like a tree, each block a branch with a face painted in its leaves. Someone had scrawled, we still live here across the trunk in silver marker. In 2B, the adopted lives on the folk wall seemed to multiply the longer she looked. A girl with braces holding a flute, a boy in a soccer jersey, a kid with a grin wide enough to swallow your objections. Bernice was making tea. We decided if we have to pack, we'll pack with hospitality, she said. It's a tradition among my people to carry dignity out the door. I shouldn't be here, Angela admitted. Not on a Sunday, not without... She gestured toward the absent leather folder, like a cathedral where faith had gone thin. Do you have family nearby? Family is a verb, Bernice said, and at that exact moment the door knocked, and the first wave of that verb arrived. A young woman with locks the colour of honey burst in with grocery bags. "Mama B," she called, and set oranges and flour and an improbable amount of cilantro on the counter. "Tori," Bernice said, pulling her close, "you didn't have to." "You raised me out of a shelter on a bus pass," Tori replied. "I can bring cilantro." Then a man in a postal uniform, Samir, then twins with matching dimples, Aisha and Grace, a man in a paramedic jacket, Miguel. And a teenager came shyly behind them, an overnight bag slung across his shoulder and a neurodivergent restlessness in his fingers. Amari, the newest, still learning to be looked at without flinching. They filled the room and spilled into the hall, and the building leaned toward their noise like an old friend listening at the door. Angela stood, suddenly feeling like an apology, in a room full of gratitude. Harold saw her discomfort and waved her to the arm of his chair. "Family meeting," he said. "If there's bad news, better to pass the plate." Angela told them what the ledger said. 3 months, late fees, notice served, marshal likely soon. She tried to keep her voice clean and uninflected, but it snagged on the parts that sounded like eulogies. She explained payment plans, assistance, the chance that anything might interrupt a schedule, if only a clerk took a lunch break at the right moment. Tori put her hands on her hips. "How much?" she asked. Angela told them the number. The room did a collective math, the kind that runs on checking accounts and pride. Aisha said she had savings, but needed a car repair. Grace said she could ask her partner. Samir said he could pick up overtime. Miguel said he could sell a guitar he never played. Amari stared at the floor and then whispered, "I have $57 in an envelope." Bernice touched his shoulder. "Baby, you keep your $57, she said. "You earned it, sweeping up at the barber." "Will—" The door knocked again. A man in a suit Angela recognised from the firm's lobby stepped in, too slick not to be carrying bad news. He was from the city's housing office, a liaison who spoke 2 languages, law and shrug. "I heard about the Jacobs file," he said, not unkindly. "There's an emergency assistance pool, but it's low. The council member is working on it." He looked around the room at the faces. "You have support." That's more than many, Angela felt suddenly drafted. The only person in the room with a badge pinned under her sweater that said the other side. She thought of Victor's champagne in the fridge and imagined it foaming across the tile. "May I see your file?" Tori asked Angela, not waiting for permission before opening it. Her eyebrows angled. "They charge late fees for repairs they didn't do." "It's not that simple," Angela said, because that's what she had been trained to say. But inside, something creaked like a door with a swollen frame. The second test came the next morning. Angela showed up at work early, but the lights didn't flicker on with her. Victor was already in, jacket off, sleeves rolled, the air around him humming with potential. "We're not waiting," he said. "We scheduled the marshal for Thursday." "I want this clear." Angela tapped her pen. "Sir, the tenants have community support. There's a chance of assistance if we—" Victor's smile was the kind men use when they've already decided how a story ends. "Angela, do you want to be senior property manager by the 4th quarter?" The question sat like a coin in her mouth. She could swallow it and buy something with it later. The flaw that had carried her so far, detachment laced with ambition, set a hand on her shoulder again. She said, "I'll make the call." She made 2 calls. The first was to the marshal's office. She felt the way you feel when you press the accept button on a surgery you both need and dread. The clerk was polite. "Thursday, 9 a.m, they said. "Building must provide access. The process is the process." The second call she placed outside on the steps where the concrete warmed her through her coat, to Bernice. "I'm so sorry," she said, and meant the words like penance. "Thursday." Bernice was quiet a long time. "Then we'll be ready Thursday," she said, And Angela? Her voice softened to something that could hold a blessing or a warning. You should be ready too. It was a strange thing to say to the person carrying your bad news, but Angela felt it hook behind her ribs, a fish line tugging her toward a new shore. Wednesday night, a storm blew through the city, all howling wind and trash can ballet. Angela couldn't sleep. She thought of the blue door, the photos, the cilantro, the teenagers trying to stand still in a world that kept moving under them. She thought of her mother's question about tables. She thought of the process, capital P, that had become a god they had all agreed to worship, because it was easier than asking if the god deserved praise. At 7:30 a.m. Thursday, she arrived at Lincoln Terrace ahead of the marshal. A handful of people stood outside. Samir in his postal jacket, Miguel in paramedic greens, Tori with a carafe of coffee, the twins holding a folded banner that said, "Home is a verb." A few neighbours drifted in, carrying baked goods like they were arriving at a wake. Angela stepped inside. The hallway was tidy. The Jacobs' blue door was propped open, a deliberate act of courage. Inside, boxes were stacked but not sealed. On the kitchen table lay a stack of paper. Letters. Each had a name at the top, in looping script, and a photograph slipped into the envelope. "What is this?" Angela asked, throat thick. Bernice smiled. "We write blessings when it's time to move," she said. "If we go, we leave good words behind. If we stay, we pass them around anyway. Good words don't need addresses." At 9, the marshal arrived with 2 officers, their faces set to neutral. A representative from the firm came too. Not Victor, but one of his lieutenants, a man with a wristwatch that probably had a more complicated name than watch. He looked at Angela like she was part of the furniture. He had a packet of forms. He had a checklist. The process is the elevator opened, the hallway filled. Not with protesters exactly, but with a flood. More faces from the frames on the wall, bodies older than their pictures, some in scrubs and some in suits, some with babies on hips, and some with hair that had learned grey. They came like a tide of yesterdays turned into today's hands. "Tori! Grace! Amari! Mama B! Dad!" Voices braided. The building, which had held its breath, exhaled. A woman in a judge's robe, Judge Roberta Lane, the caption under her photo had said Reby 2001, stood beside the marshal calmly. "I am here as a private citizen," she said, "but I can tell you that the courts take into account community hardship and owner neglect of critical repairs. I've reviewed the public record. This building has violations pending." The marshal looked down at his clipboard, then up at the crowd, then at the officer, whose jaw softened the way jaws do when someone remembers he has a grandmother. A science teacher with chalk dust still on his cuffs. Evan, 2006, handed Angela a folder. "We gathered pledges," he said. "Real money. 3 months plus a plan for the next 2A nurse. Keisha, 2005. Held up receipts for a GoFundMe that had exploded overnight after someone posted a thread titled, 'They Raised Us.' Now we hold them a city council aid. Lydia, 2010, waved a stamped document showing emergency assistance approved and queued for transfer. Then a slender teen edged forward. Amari, fingers tapping, chin up like a sail catching wind. He cleared his throat. "I wrote a letter," he said, small voice fat with courage. He faced the firm's man with the complicated watch. "Dear sir," he read, "if home is just a place, then you can move it like a chess piece. If home is a promise, then when you break it, it breaks you too. I am 12. I have lived in 8 places. This is the first one that taught me the names of the pigeons. Please don't teach me that promises are for sale." Silence, the kind that rearranges furniture in your heart, settled over the hallway. Angela felt something click. Not a seatbelt, but a lock she'd never noticed on the door she kept inside herself. The air, Process had met a presence. The checklist had met children with surnames stitched to theirs like patches on a jacket. She looked at the marshal. The marshal looked at the law and found, for a moment, a margin. Given the assistance shown, the pending repairs, and the community hardship, the marshal said carefully, we are postponing today's action pending judicial review. He turned, checked with his officers, and then with the building representative. You're served with notice of the postponement. He handed a form to the man with the watch, who looked as if his day had mispronounced his name. Outside, a cheer went up, not a stadium roar, but a church yes. People hugged the air around them. Keisha cried into Tori's shoulder. Miguel lifted Amari without asking, and spun him once and set him down with a grin that said, you belong on the ground, but don't forget you can fly. Angela stepped into the apartment, past the blue door, whose paint had flaked in a heart shape near the handle. She found Harold sitting in his chair by the philodendron, tears caught in his beard. So, he asked, voice careful, like not stepping on a newly mopped floor. For now, Angela said, letting the words be a bridge rather than a wall. You're home. Bernice took Angela's hand between both of hers. Child, she said, old country and city at once. You can't keep all the rules and still keep your soul if the rules have holes. You have to stitch teach me, Angela said, surprising herself with how fast the words came. Teach me how to stitch. The rest of Thursday turned into a folk test, the kind old stories whisper about, a trial not of strength but of heart. The buildings inspector arrived, pushed along by Lydia's urgent texts. He walked the units with tenants pointing out radiators that coughed, and windows that sweated, and stairs that had learned the language of groans. He wrote things on a pad with the deliberation of a man who had finally been given permission to see what he already knew. Victor called Angela 3 times. She declined twice and answered once. What exactly is happening? He demanded. Community hardship, she said evenly, pending repairs. Assistance funds, media interest. She didn't say your champagne is warm. We cannot set a precedent, he said. We already have, she replied. She thought of Amari's letter. She thought of the judge, there without her bench, but not without her backbone. But it can be the right precedent, she added, and was surprised to hear herself speaking like a person who didn't just finish, but began. Victor's pride did what pride does when it meets a mirror. It looked for a smaller room. Handle it, he snapped. Handle it. The test sharpened. Angela could go the old route, manage the optics, placate the crowd, reschedule the thunder to a quieter day. Or she could do what Bernice had asked, stitch. She found a set of options. She'd learned to see clauses like doors. Now she looked for windows. There existed, if you knew how to pull it off the shelf, a city-sponsored memorandum of repair and rent abatement. It allowed tenants to place a portion of rent into escrow until violations were cured, and allowed an owner to apply assistance funds to arrears conditioned on repairs completed. It wasn't clean, it wasn't quick. It was law, and it was mercy dressed in municipal clothing. She drafted it. She put the numbers in orderly columns, so Victor's eyes could recognize that justice could be justified. She CC'd the liaison, Lydia from the council office, and Judge Lane, as a community stakeholder, she wrote, which made the judge laugh and reply, "Citizen is fine." She wrote a new line on a blank page. "Today I will start 2B." By nightfall, they had signatures. Not Victor's yet, that would come with a phone call, where money looked like a life raft instead of an anchor, but enough to hold back the flood. The adopted children left and returned and left again, bringing food and tools and stories that stuck to Angela's skin. She didn't notice when she started calling them the kids, as if she had been invited into a grammar where love refuses past tense. At 10 p.m, she finally called her mother. We held a table, Angela said, and through the line she could hear her mother smile. The next morning, news of the postponed eviction and the family that raised a neighbourhood perched at the top of local feeds. Not all spotlights are kind, but this one, for once, felt warm. Articles ran photos of the blue door and the wall of frames, and a quote from Amari's letter that made readers put down their coffee and stare out windows at pigeons they hadn't bothered to name. Victor, whose pride had been personified into its own restless entity, tried to pivot. Price and West partners with community, a press release now boasted, as if partnership had been architecture instead of emergency. Investors called with cautious approval, good optics, minimal delay, positive brand equity. The reprieve was positioned as strategy. Angela could go the old route, manage the optics, placate the crowd, reschedule the thunder to a quieter day. Or she could do what Bernice had asked, stitch. She found a set of options. She'd learned to see clauses like doors. Now she looked for windows. There existed, if you knew how to pull it off the shelf, a city-sponsored memorandum of repair and rent abatement. It allowed tenants to place a portion of rent into escrow until violations were cured, and allowed an owner to apply assistance funds to arrears conditioned on repairs completed. It wasn't clean, it wasn't quick. It was law, and it was mercy dressed in municipal clothing. She drafted it. She put the numbers in orderly columns, so Victor's eyes could recognise that justice could be justified. She CC'd the liaison, Lydia from the council office, and Judge Lane as a community stakeholder, she wrote, which made the judge laugh and reply, "Citizen is fine." She wrote a new line on a blank page. "Today I will start to B." By nightfall they had signatures. Not Victor's yet. That would come with a phone call where money looked like a life raft instead of an anchor. But enough to hold back the flood. The adopted children left and returned and left again, bringing food and tools and stories that stuck to Angela's skin. She didn't notice when she started calling them the kids, as if she had been invited into a grammar where love refuses past tense. At 10 p.m, she finally called her mother. "We held a table," Angela said, and through the line she could hear her mother smile. The next morning, news of the postponed eviction and the family that raised a neighbourhood perched at the top of local feeds. Not all spotlights are kind, but this one, for once, felt warm. Articles ran photos of the blue door and the wall of frames, and a quote from Amari's letter that made readers put down their coffee and stare out windows at pigeons they hadn't bothered to name. Victor, whose pride had been personified into its own restless entity, tried to pivot. Price and West partners with community, a press release now boasted, as if partnership had been architecture instead of emergency. Investors called with cautious approval, good optics, minimal delay, positive brand equity. The reprieve was positioned as strategy. Angela could have laughed or cried. Instead, she kept working. Repairs began quickly at first. No one schedules like a company afraid of an inspector who now knows the building's first name. Radiators hissed, then purred. A contractor replaced a cracked banister and, on Bernice's request, painted it the colour of coffee with cream, the exact shade that says hands have been here and will be again. The abatement was set. Funds flowed into escrow. Late fees were forgiven as part of a negotiated addendum that looked in the end as tidy as anything Angela had ever filed. Only this time, tidiness felt like justice instead of camouflage. And then came the reversal, a calmer's patient step. Victor, impatient with how long a repaired conscience takes to show profits, pushed too quickly on another building across town. He cut corners. He ignored a sprinkler inspection. When a pipe burst and flooded 3 floors, the city, newly attentive, levied fines substantial enough to endanger his quarterly smile. The block renewal slide deck now had a jagged crack through one of its bars. In a meeting where Angela stood with her new spine visible beneath her blazer, Victor attempted the old magic. Blame, then boast, then bargain. But the room had learned another language. The council office called in, cool and prepared, to say the firm's future approvals would be conditioned on a community dignity plan, drafted with the very tenants whose lives the spreadsheets had once treated as footnotes. Pride doesn't like being graded on empathy. Victor raged to anyone who would listen that the city had lost its mind. But investors, those connoisseurs of risk, saw order in the new approach. They began to ask Angela, not Victor, for updates on tenant engagement and equitable timelines. Ego found itself demoted, while patience and process, stitched to mercy, was promoted. As for Angela, she spent more afternoons at Lincoln Terrace than her job strictly required. She learned that Harold's cane was a stubborn, beloved thing that squeaked exactly once per hallway length. She learned that Bernice collected salt shakers, the odder the better, and that people mailed them from vacations. An Eiffel Tower, a tiny llama, a pineapple with freckles. She learned that Amari could memorize bus schedules like poetry and was teaching himself coding on a donated laptop, building a game where your avatar doesn't win by collecting coins, but by collecting names remembered correctly. "Are we safe?" Amari asked one evening, helping Angela rehang the last of the photo frames on the freshly painted wall. "We are safer," Angela answered, tasting the honesty of the comparative. "Safety, like faith, prefers verbs. And you have a lot of people who will make it safer still." The adopted children kept arriving. The wall needed a second row. People began to joke that 2B had a revolving door of siblings. They held potlucks labelled with index cards so Angela could learn everyone's handwriting. They told stories beginning with "Remember when," followed by small acts that had been both rescue and routine. Late-night rides to auditions, algebra explained until it stopped snarling, the week the electric bill was a dragon and Harold killed it with overtime. "We weren't heroes," Harold said when Angela called them that. "We just decided not to look away." And because every fable needs a moment when the lesson steps forward like a character, Bernice invited Angela to choir rehearsal at the church that now met in the basement of a community centre while funds gathered for their new sanctuary. Angela, who hadn't sung in public since a 6th grade incident involving a squeaky note and a boy named Jason, sat in the back and let the sound wash over her like a kind of sense she'd mislaid. At break, Bernice handed her a sheet of music. "We're doing an old freedom song," she said, eyes bright. "There's a line you need to carry." Angela stared at the notes. "I'm not. You're the finisher, remember?" Bernice's smile told her this title had been redeemed. "Finish this with us." The line was simple. "I won't be moved." Not stubborn like stone, but rooted like a tree that spreads shade to anyone who wanders near. Angela sang, quiet at first, then with a voice that surprised her by how easily it fit into the room, like a hand that finds another hand in the dark and realizes it has been rehearsing that grip forever. When the new lease arrived, 5 years stabilized, with a rider for repairs and a clause giving first right refusal on any sale, it bore Angela's initials in the drafting block. She owned none of it and all of it. She had stitched, and the seam held. On the day they signed, a small neighbourhood parade formed with grocery carts decorated in ribbons, children chalking the sidewalk with words like "staying home," and someone bringing a speaker that played "Ain't No Stopping Us Now," because sometimes subtlety is overrated. Judge Lane came, the inspector came, in plain clothes, because even inspectors deserve to dance. Lydia came, the liaison came, and tried to look like he'd planned this flow of mercy all along. Victor stayed away. Pride often does. The adopted children brought gifts that looked like continuations rather than endings. A new doormat with a blue heart, a a framed print of the mural from outside, with "We Still Live Here" professionally lettered this time. A cookbook, with notes scribbled in the margins like prayers. Amari handed Angela a small envelope with a sticker of a pigeon on it. Inside was a note. "Thank you for teaching me that the law is a pencil, not a hammer. P.S. The tall pigeon with the scar on his beak is named Captain. He says hi." Angela laughed until tears came. Then she let the tears stay. The emotion arc completed its circle in her chest. Curiosity, reflection, calm, lesson, gratitude, like stepping stones across a creek she'd once been afraid to cross. That evening, as the sun turned the building, the colour of honey, and the blue door glowed like a promise inked on the day itself, Angela stood in the hallway and added her own photo to the wall. Not in the centre, this wasn't her story stage, but tucked on the edge with a little label written in Bernice's hand. Angela, who finished and began. The karma came quietly for the antagonist, as it often does in stories. That trust time. Victor bypassed for the firm's next big account because we need someone who can see the whole neighbourhood, not just the numbers. Left to start a consultancy that specialised in expedited transitions. It did not thrive. Pride, when personified and underfed, eats itself. As for Harold and Bernice, they kept adopting, in all the ways that word can stretch and still be true. Not every child moved in, but many moved closer to themselves because of the couple's particular way of saying hello. Every week someone new came by with cilantro or sheet music or a broken toaster. Every month a letter appeared in their mailbox with a return address that was really just a history from someone who used to be lost, and Angela kept her lists. But now the list on her mug sometimes read things like "Today I will," "Learn Captain's route," or "Today I will, draft a clause that holds grace." She learned that order isn't kindness by itself, it's an instrument. In the wrong hands it can cut, in the right hands it can carve a table big enough for everyone you didn't realise was already yours. One afternoon in late summer, Amari showed Angela his finished game on the laptop. The avatar walked streets that looked suspiciously like Lincoln Terrace, collecting the names of pigeons, the titles of songs, and the stories of neighbours. There was a blue door you could open. Inside, a wall of frames. If you clicked on any of them, a small voice told you the origin story of a person who had been carried until they could carry someone else. "What do you win?" Angela asked. Amari shrugged. "You don't lose," he said. "That's a kind of winning." "Show me how to play," she said. And he did, and she learned. And in a world where so much breaks, a small thing kept not breaking, over and over, like a hymn you can hum even with your mouth closed. Power without empathy is a blunt instrument. Justice requires a steady hand and a listening ear. Home is not just a place you own, it's a promise you keep. If someone near you is facing eviction or displacement, don't look away. Join or start a neighbourhood support circle. Learn your local tenants' rights and show up, money if you have it, time if you don't. Be the hands that stitch the holes in the rules.